Peter Lamborn Wilson. Well, I thought that you would ask me that, and so I thought about it a little bit, and I came up with the idea that among many other things I could say, poetry is more like action than prose. It's like in elementary school when you used to do show and tell. It seems to me that that prose is like telling, but poetry is like showing. So it's more like action, but it still isn't itself completely action. It's still writing, and therefore it still must be representation. And therefore, for that reason, I've pushed what I do farther towards the pole of activity or action, leaving behind simply the simple written page, I guess. And I do these vanishing art installations or routines or works or whatever you want to call them, or I have been doing them as prolongations of poetry into a further level of action. Mm-hmm. And the action in that case being, then it takes on certain elements of art, but it takes on certain elements of performance, certain elements of magic, conceptual art, also historical art, also writing remains a great part of it. So most of these pieces are about they're all about place, they're all about landscape, and they're all about the history of those places and landscapes. So they've arisen out of my research into local history here in the Hudson Valley mostly, so that I can actually bring all of those elements together. Mm-hmm. It's not that I want to be a regionalist in any, I'm not going to start using New York dialect if there were such a thing anyway. I don't think there is anymore, double Dutch or whatever. No, not in that sense. But I have to be a regionalist because I have to be able to be in the place while I'm doing the work, instead of with writing where you can get step back from it in time and place.
Yeah.
So to me it seems a little bit more engagé, to use a term from fencing. And I don't know whether it's not an ideal, and I don't think it's anything particularly new either. I think a lot of other people have done similar things, but maybe not so many people have come to it through written word into the art thing. Mm-hmm. A lot of people look on this, a lot of people who do this kind of thing, they look on it as on the form, and they see it only as art, but I see it also as a form of writing. Mm-hmm. So that's my position at the moment, and I can't think of anything.
Okay. Oh, can I?
But if you can ask questions,
that's the question.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
Uh-huh. Okay. You mentioned magic. This is, of course, the hardest dimension to talk about in terms of art and poetry, but it's obviously central to your view as it is to mine. And so my question would be, the experience for you of the poem, whether it would be a poem that you consider to be in the domain of the magical in some sense, or your own work, is it in the experience? Because if you say it's an action, then the action would imply that it's of the nature of the thing of which it speaks.
Right. Well, I like to point out that what I'm doing is not ceremonial magic in the strict sense of the word. Mm-hmm. I mean, I use Cornelius Agrippa and other sources as inspiration, but I couldn't do it as ceremonial magic. For one thing, then I would have to tie everything in with astrology. Mm-hmm. So I'd be doing it only at the precise right moment, and trying to get everything organized in a place. And of course, I don't drive, so I need people to assist me in these, and I need people to assist me in other ways in these works too.
Right.
They're meant to be social events, private social events is another way of looking at them. And so I can't tell everybody they have to be there on the cusp of Neptune when it's entering into Sagittarius or whatever.
Right.
It's just not going to work.
Right.
And I can't be sacrificing the tongue of the newt and the eye of the frog. It's just silly, right? We don't do that kind of thing. But it's a very strong influence on what I do. and in the sense that what I speak and what I do want to come closer and closer together. And that's in that sense very much. If that's magic, then yes. But if it means a specific kind of mumbo jumbo, then no. It's influenced by that. Just like it's influenced by performance art, but it's not a performance. I don't perform. I just do the thing that I'm going to do.
Yeah.
I don't make a theatrical big deal about doing it.
Uh-huh.
The way performance artists do.
Right. Well, you're focusing very much on the action aspect of it, the art, whatever you would think of that as, whether you think of it as art, and you do think of it, as you said, as writing, and the performative aspect of it in the sense of performance rather than performative in the sense that the poem is the event of which it speaks, and the event doesn't exist separate from the poem. I want to bring it a little bit back toward the act of writing itself, not the action as writing, but writing as its own action. And is that a magical process?
That's been a big disappointment over the years, over the centuries of the Romantic movement. So many people have tried to write as if writing could be or is, and of course one immediately thinks the casebook, the textbook case is Rimbaud's Sonnet of the Vowels. But look what happened to Rimbaud. He gave it up in disgust and stopped writing and went to Africa to make money.
That's one view. We don't know why he did it.
Well, I think if you read his last works, clearly he's renouncing magic. He's saying it didn't work and it was stupid to think of it. It's very dark. His last writing.
What about Nerval?
Nerval went crazy and hanged himself.
Well, a lot of musicians have too.
Yeah, it's a dangerous thing. I mean, I worship the ground that Nerval walked on. I wish I could go to Paris and follow his every footstep, even more than Rimbaud in a lot of ways. Because he was such a conscious hermeticist. And some of his writing, if anybody's writing ever does approach it, certainly his does at points. But it's always a big disappointment. Something's lacking, and that's what drove me to take this further step. But believe me, I'm not saying I've found a solution to the problem, the romantic problem, or the problem of romanticism, because that's what we're talking about.
Nor have you abandoned it.
No,
obviously.
Not at all. No.
Yeah, but the writing. Going back to the writing, what it is for you what is the writing for you? Because you made a distinction that it's not a representation only of something out there like landscape or history.
When I made that difference between prose and poetry, which was probably too facile and simple a difference, but
we won't go there.
I think it has some truth to it.
Yeah.
At least for me, I wanted to be a poet. Then I came to the realization in the early '80s that no one was reading poetry anymore. That it was was no longer a public act. That the whole idea of the bard was finished. That was a beatnik thing, and that was over. So I actually took my poems and turned them into prose, so that people would read them. And I said, these are political manifestos. I stopped calling them poems, and it kind of worked. People did take much more notice of them then. So then, little by little, however, I started writing prose. And for 20 years, I was very wrapped up with prose and with the problems of history, anthropology, economics, history of religions, et cetera, in this desperate 20-year project to figure out what the hell is going on in the world, in reality. And that was a very prosaic task, if I can put it that way. And then, around the middle to the end of the 90s, when I kind of figured out what was going on, or at least wanted to move on to another stage, it seemed to me that I would go back to poetry, knowing full well that it's a failure, that it doesn't communicate, that it's not taken seriously, and that I would just have to live with that and have to write out of that, write in that position. Because if you try to think seriously of poets as unacknowledged legislators, It may have been true once, but in the postmodern period, it no longer seems to be so. Poets don't set the trends in a postmodern situation, where there's no possibility of an avant-garde, where every movement comes back to haunt the world together, you know, and no one movement is ahead of any other movement, and no group of people is saying, look, do it our way, and then that'll be the revolution, and then everyone can be a poet. That is the romantic goal, ultimately, is that everyone should be an artist, right? I think if you could sum up the whole romantic revolution in one phrase, that would be it. And modern poetry is not in a position to make that happen. So the best you can say is that failure is a kind of success in the modern world, because if something is successful, it almost kind of indicates there's something wrong with it, you know, that there's something corrupt about it.
It's like that thing. I'm editing the things from the Robert Kelly event in New York, and I'm listening to parts of it as I do it, all those things, but I'm about a third of the way through, and putting them online as I go. And John Yellow's opening remark in this, what's his name, novel, Chaser, was his name, the novelist that he refers to right at the beginning of his talk, and he says, in the novel, like somebody says, what are you doing? I'm going to a poetry reading. Which one? I'm going to hear, what's his name, who was translated Dante, who was the poet laureate,
Chardy?
Yeah, not Chardy, but the more recent one. You know who I'm talking about, Raymond?
Robert Haas?
Yeah, huh?
Haas?
Not Haas, but Robert Pinsky.
Oh, Robert Pinsky.
He says, so I'm going to hear Robert Pinsky. And the guy says, that's not a poetry reading.
Well, I'm not going to say anything about that. I mean, if you're going to talk about the people who have been our poet laureates over the past,
well, there you have it.
Then success is not what we're looking for.
No, right, exactly. But okay, not to in any way disagree with anything that you've said. Just to point out that you are in a curious kind of position here, because your heart is in being a communitarian, and the other part of your heart, you have different chambers apparently of your heart, because another part of your heart is obviously an esoterist, which by definition cannot speak to the world at large in any direct way. That's why we use the word esoteric. It's not.
I suppose that's true.
So you're a communitarian.
But that seems like almost like a quibble.
It's not a quibble, because there is an authentic community. You two people in this room are affected by your work as a magical act of great power. At least one of the definitions of magic, that not necessarily ritual magic or ceremonial magic or...
well, let's say that magic is supposed to change the world.
Well, how do you know?
Which is another reason why I don't want to make it the claim that I'm actually doing it.
No, I understand that, and I'm on your side there. But a Kabbalist might say, however, the fact that the world has not yet split apart is because the magic is working.
Yes, of course, and that's what native people always say, that if they didn't say these prayers, then the sun wouldn't come up and the world would stop going. And that's a nice thought, but we don't think that way. We moderns don't think that way, or postmodern people don't.
Who are you speaking about when you say that? You don't think that way?
No, in my heart of hearts, I can't say that I do.
Okay, maybe the hyperbole of making the sun come up is a little too extreme for us, but there are other aspects of vital sustenance, psychic clarity and orientation.
No, you're not going to get me to say that poetry is useless. I wouldn't. That's not what I meant. What I meant was that it was powerless.
That doesn't make sense to me. If you're saying that, if we're acknowledging that it does have a certain kind of power. Let me go back to one thing. The distinction about what magic is. I'm very aligned in my mind a lot of the time with the kind of ideas of natural magic, Ficini and people like that, and the natural magic might be expressed as a recognition that magical operations are going on because mind is pervasive with everything, and the magician is the one who knows to see that. It kind of has a Taoist aspect and aligns himself with this.
Okay, that's certainly true. However, there is an operative aspect of magic, especially when you start reading people like Cornelius Agrippa.
Right, of course. Yeah.
And for that matter, Ficino, who talks in his planetary rituals, are meant for healing.
Yeah.
So they are meant to change the world.
Yeah.
They're meant to change at least one body, and that would be first of all the body of the practitioner.
Mm-hmm.
But I think Ficino also was slyly proposing at least a small community of people to be involved in this new religion he was that he was inventing or reinventing. So. Of course, there's the idea, there's the magic that you do absolutely alone, and which is like that natural magic, which is being part of the Tao in some way. But then there's this operative idea to magic, where it's going to change the world in some in the way that Marx meant when he said philosophy hasn't changed the world.
Doesn't that tend to Hollywoodize the expectation of the effect that we're going to have?
What can I say? I'm an unreconstructed person of the generation of '68.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree.
I haven't given up those ideas. I haven't given them up.
Yeah, but we don't have to be attached to a particular image of how that would come about. That's my point.
No, but if we want what we do to be working on that level, that's something entirely different.
Yeah, well, of course. Yeah.
That's the bardic level. That is the bardic level.
Right.
The way not only the ancient Celtic bards saw it, but also the Ginsbergian bards.
The more effective bards in our historical memory, like Whitman, didn't read Agrippa, as far as we know. He didn't read. He wasn't an esoterist. He was something else. He was something he perhaps invented by being who he was.
I'm not so sure. Didn't he? Wasn't he in touch with that guy Buckland who wrote the thing about the cosmos?
Perhaps, but it doesn't mean. I don't mean he didn't have sympathies in that direction. I mean that his actual energy, the way it worked. We like Ginsberg. Ginsberg. Look at it. I mean, he was
a Blakean, totally involved in magic.
Yeah, I agree. I totally agree. Yeah. But he accepted a role that had a certain modesty. And one of the beautiful things about Ginsberg was his actual modesty, his willingness to put himself on the line.
Well, naturally, of course, he thought it was funny also to be a bard in the modern world.
He sure did.
Putting his queer shoulder to the wheel.
Absolutely.
I thought that was amusing.
It was amusing.
Even ironic, if you like.
Too. Yeah.
But that didn't stop him and his whole and that whole generation, which had so much influence on me. Yeah. From thinking that there must be a connection between poetry and the changing of the world.
Yeah.
That '68 was meant to have been, and of course wasn't.
Well, Ginsberg was, as far as I'm concerned, in Rocky Flats protest. I mean, I actually think they saved the world from destruction. I think that if that plutonium had not been stopped at that point, that there's no minimal dose of plutonium, any of it in the atmosphere is deadly. I mean, they saved a lot. They actually were very effective, and there are a certain number of instances, and you might be seeing one right now with the Wall Street occupation protest.
Why, is that being run by poets? I hadn't heard.
No, but it's got some in it. There's some there.
Are there?
Yeah. I don't even mean by poets, but I just mean the possibility for the generation of people who would listen to a Ginsberg are running that. And it's incredible to me that to see that awakening in that way is not.
It could happen, but it hasn't. In my view, it hasn't. It hasn't happened yet.
I want to go. We're going to agree on that, but I want to say that I'm really interested in what happens inside the language. Your poetry is powerful for me. I mean, it's obviously I feel a kinship with it, which we acknowledged when I gave you some of Poetics to read. That there is some kind of root sympathy there, and it's not at the level necessarily of that we've just been talking about, but at some other level. And I feel in those poems something that it's got a humorous quality. It's in that serious laughter sense of alchemy. It's got an unexpectedness, a transformative there's something in the process of the language which is magical, to my mind. I just wonder if you experienced that yourself, or you are attached to that
Well,
idea.
gosh, how am I supposed to say no?
Yeah, right. How
that
can I say no? It's like when this great Tibetan teacher was talking at Yale, and somebody, a very funny guy too, he's very smart. Somebody asked him, he says, "We're here in New Haven, and the scriptures say that every place is Avalokiteshvara in manifestation. Do you feel that way about New Haven?" And he says, "How can I say no?"
One would be tempted in New Haven, if anywhere. No, obviously not, and I can't deny that aspect is always forefront in my mind in what I do.
Tell me how you see that aspect, what that is for you.
I mean, my complete development as a writer owes, for example, as much to Persian Sufism as it does to the Western poetic tradition. Already when I was a teenager, I was already involved in reading Sufi poems in translation and rewriting them in order to make them sound better in English so that I could read them with pleasure. And I've been doing stuff like that all my life. And I lived in Iran for 7 years. I lived in India for 3 years. So there's that whole side of things, of my work. And I've been a historian of religions, and I've been a historian of the religions of those countries where I lived, as well as others. So I write out of, in that sense, I'm writing out of not a tradition, but maybe many traditions, including modern poetry, which of course I was also brought up on. So all of that is absolutely inseparable from themes of magic and mysticism, all the way from Sufism to all the fin de siècle poets and artists that I liked so much when I was 12 or 13 years old, and which Art Nouveau and the fin de siècle period, which had so much influence on hippie aesthetic. That's because we were all looking at Dover reprints of Aubrey Beardsley stuff when we were, in elementary school, or at least I was. And I think a lot of other people were too, to judge by what happened to art in the 60s. So, which was entirely to do with magic, and even specifically to do with evoking that late 19th, early 20th century fascination with Hermeticism that was still producing. I've just been reading a biography of Alfred Jarry, and he was completely wrapped up in all that. Not that the biographer was very sensitive to it, because most modern scholars are not.
Right.
But I could see, reading between the lines, what Jarry must have been reading in terms of Hermeticism and the European magical tradition. It's very, very important for that entire aesthetic world.
Absolutely.
And ergo, and Duchamp, although it's only recently that people talk about Duchamp as a Hermeticist.
Because of his connection with Jarry is also part of it, though. I mean, in that very sense, yeah.
Absolutely. And those people in turn came out of the world of de Nerval and Baudelaire and Rimbaud and Charles Fourier, the utopian socialist philosopher, who was very important for all of them in resurrecting Hermeticism in French poetry.
But there's the other connection, like in the language itself, like there's Mallarmé, okay? And
he was another one.
Another one, yeah. And Mallarmé...
Anarcho-symbolists, I call them.
Oh, that's interesting, yeah. Well, Mallarmé would be probably my, other than Blake, my deepest model of something that keeps calling me to the view that magic happens in the interstices of language itself.
That was his belief. Yeah. And of course I love him, and I always think, when I hear about it, was it Tuesday evenings that he used to get together? Or I always think of myself being there. I've study photographs of him in his rooms and
Le Livre, that book, the book.
Yeah, and he, of course, little known fact, he himself was a lifelong anarchist activist. He subscribed to all the anarchist magazines. He supported all the causes. He gave, he signed all the petitions. He wasn't a fighter, he was a poet, but his beliefs were completely anarchistic. As I think were Jarry and all those people.
Yeah, and it also it actually adds something to the theory and practice of anarchistic anarchistic way of being, orientation, when you consider that fact that they are, because there's a way in which, you could say, it's inside language itself. The principles of anarchism are inside the poetic somehow. That's what I want to find. That's what I want to hear something more. I know that you practice it, and I just want to hear if you think that you practice it, or you think about it. I read you that way.
Let's just put it this way.
Yeah.
I wish I had a big overblown ego and I could just say, yeah, that's what I do. But instead, since I like to be modest, I will say that's what I wish that I could be seeing myself as doing.
Well, how about this idea? If the poet is the sense in which the poet is the unacknowledged legislator of the world might be that the poet creates the possible reader. That is to say, I would see your poems, or the ecologues would be my current best model in your work of this, as drawing the mind into a possible way with language, a possible way of action in the sense that you mean it precisely, but happening at the level of language, so that its effect is on the mind of the person, and you wouldn't be able to tell maybe for a generation whether that took seed. Just in terms of how long it takes for people to sometimes process radically new things.
Well, I'll just say again that it was finishing that book. Then that's what impelled me to go into this next step. Because although I'm probably more satisfied with that book than any of my other books, it still wasn't it yet.
There's no way it is.
No, I suppose there never is.
Yeah.
But I had to push out into this slightly more ceremonial, slightly more performative, slightly more artistic, physical, object-related, action-related.
Right. Well, you've just made me realize something. That one of the senses in which poetic action actually does influence history, which is anything that happens from it in the world. That may be a minute little bit of history, but it's history. And who knows what the seed will produce, because everything starts small and gets big.
Right.
The way that you just said, that making those poems then kind of spills forward into action, is the very proof of the poetics that you've been talking about. For you did it.
Okay, inshallah, as we say in Persian. God willing.
Well, yeah, it must be willing. It wouldn't be happening, would it?
That's what I can't say. It would be a jinx if I said that.
Okay. Well, I don't know if we're there at all, but
I think we've run out of time anyway.
Well, possibly, yeah. We are at 30 minutes and 14 seconds. So.
Oh, okay. But if that satisfies you, is that the...
Listen, I'm never going to be satisfied.
These things are usually not more than a few minutes, are they?
No, that's not all I'm after. We're going to do longer versions, by the way, of individuals. Of poetry as slash...
Well, sometime when we have an open end, so that we're not thinking...
I know, I'd like to do a part 2 after this, actually, if we could. Because actually, I have to say that I'm exploiting this occasion with you, because these are questions I wanted to talk to you about in some sort of intensely focused way that kind of puts you on the spot, so that you have to kind of come up with something even though you may be reluctant to it. It's because they're difficult questions. These are hard questions. But because of my passionate interest in your work, I want to...
All right, well, let's cut this one with inshallah.
Okay.
And I'd be happy to do another one with you sometime.